The replacement plaque was still resting on a velvet-covered easel when Quinn Rothschild saw it. Her name was gone. The bronze plate that had once recognized 12 years of donations, acquisitions, and preservation work now displayed Fiona Langley beneath the crest of the City Museum. Quinn stood with a red leather document case in one hand. Across the room, Alastair Cromwell adjusted the cuff of his black suit and lifted a glass toward a crowd of collectors, patrons, and auction clients. Beside him, Fiona smiled in an ivory evening gown as cameras turned in her direction. Then Alastair delivered the final insult. He announced that Fiona represented the future of the Cromwell legacy, while Quinn had failed to provide the family with an heir worthy of its name. A few guests looked away. Others remained silent. Quinn studied the plaque one last time. Then she understood. This was not a replacement. It was an erasure. She stopped looking at the wall and started thinking about the records. Quinn left before the applause ended. She crossed the private exhibition wing, ignored the reception staff, and entered a restricted archive corridor connected to the auction house's historical holdings. The noise of the event faded behind her. The records remained. A security credential still granted her access to the provenance vault because nobody had considered removing the one authority they believed they no longer needed. That mistake mattered. Inside the vault, rows of protected files stretched from floor to ceiling. Quinn moved directly to a locked cabinet reserved for lineage documentation connected to donor estates and private collections. She entered a code. The drawer opened. There it was. A thick provenance file secured with a red wax seal bearing her authentication mark. The file contained years of verified documentation, family records, acquisition histories, inheritance trails, and chain of custody certifications that collectors trusted more than public statements. Facts survive. Quinn carried the file to a review table and began working immediately. She examined transfer records involving pieces recently moved from her collection into Cromwell ownership. She reviewed donor agreements tied to family endowments. She compared archival notes that had once seemed insignificant. No assumptions. Certain entries appeared more unusual now than they had before. References repeated across unrelated documents. Names surfaced where they should not have appeared. Dates aligned too neatly. Quinn marked each inconsistency with a red notation tab. She did not know the full answer yet. She only knew that the story Alastair was selling to the world depended entirely on bloodlines, heritage, and legitimacy. That obsession itself was a clue. Keep digging. Hours passed. The reception continued somewhere above her, celebrating a future she no longer intended to defend. Quinn opened another estate file and paused over a notation connected to a private inheritance matter from decades earlier. The detail was small, almost invisible, yet it linked two family histories that should never have intersected. She copied the reference number and secured it inside the red wax file. Then she requested additional archive retrievals through an internal preservation channel still operating under her authorization. Verify everything. When she finally closed the cabinet, she carried the provenance file beneath her arm and walked toward the exit. If Alastair wanted to build a dynasty on blood, Quinn would begin with the records. The museum opened 2 hours before the public arrived. Quinn Rothschild entered through a side entrance reserved for donors and institutional partners, carrying the same red document case she had taken from the archive vault the night before. She was not there to make a scene. She was there to confirm something for herself. The galleries looked unchanged. The marble floors reflected the morning light. The exhibits remained exactly where she remembered them. History had not moved. People had. She walked toward the donor recognition wall located beside the museum's central staircase. The moment she arrived, she stopped. Her name was gone. In its place stood Fiona Langley, listed beneath a contribution category that Quinn herself had helped establish years earlier. She stared at the polished bronze letters without speaking. No audience surrounded her. No cameras waited nearby. There was only the wall, the silence, and the realization she could no longer avoid. She saw it. The deepest wound was not Alastair's public humiliation. It was not Fiona's promotion. It was not even the accusation about heirs. The deepest wound was understanding that she had spent more than a decade building institutions that would outlive her, only to discover that the man she had protected was willing to erase her from their history the moment she became inconvenient. For years she believed that truth naturally survived. She believed authentic work eventually spoke for itself. Standing before that wall, Quinn understood how naive that belief had been. Records survive. People do not always protect them. Her eyes moved across the names surrounding Fiona's. She recognized foundations she had advised, collections she had authenticated, and donors she had personally introduced to the museum. Alastair had removed her name. He had not removed her fingerprints. That distinction mattered. Then another memory surfaced. Months earlier, Alastair had quietly sold a family heirloom ring that belonged to Quinn's side of the marriage. He claimed the sale would support an acquisition strategy. Later, she learned the proceeds had funded the purchase of a rare violin presented to Fiona. At the time, Quinn considered it a betrayal of sentiment. Now she understood it differently. The ring had not been sold because it lacked value. It had been sold because it carried her history. Alastair was not collecting objects. He was replacing narratives. Then she understood. The museum wall, the donor records, the heirloom ring, and the engagement announcement were all pieces of the same structure. Erasure. Not this time. Quinn stepped away from the wall and returned to her work. She spent the remainder of the morning reviewing reference numbers gathered during the previous night. Estate documents led to inheritance records. Inheritance records led to donor archives. Donor archives led to lineage registrations preserved by private institutions. Every verified document expanded the pattern. Every connection pointed toward a story hidden beneath decades of assumptions. No assumptions. Quinn created a separate review file and began organizing the material according to authentication standards recognized throughout the industry. She logged sources, verified dates, preserved chains of custody. Her strength had never been influence. It had always been accuracy. Facts survive. By late afternoon, she had assembled enough material to justify requesting restricted records from additional archives connected to old family estates. The request would take time. That was acceptable. Quinn was no longer trying to save a marriage, a reputation, or a place inside the Cromwell dynasty. She was protecting the truth behind it. So she moved. When she sealed the request package and placed it beside the red wax provenance file, she knew her first real choice had already been made. She would follow the evidence all the way to its conclusion, regardless of who the records destroyed. 3 days later, Quinn Rothschild sat inside a private archival research room surrounded by estate catalogs, donor registries, inheritance ledgers, and authenticated provenance reports collected from multiple institutions. The red wax provenance file remained open beside her. Every page she added increased its weight. Every verified record narrowed the space available for coincidence. Quinn worked the way she always had. Methodically, patiently, accurately. She was not searching for scandal. She was searching for continuity. Verify everything. A genealogy investigation did not begin with DNA. It began with documentation. Quinn compared estate records connected to the Cromwell family against donor archives preserved by several heritage foundations. She traced ownership histories attached to artwork, charitable trusts, and family endowments. Names appeared repeatedly across unrelated collections. Addresses overlapped. Dates aligned. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet Quinn refused to move ahead without verification. No assumptions. She submitted requests for additional records through professional channels that trusted her reputation more than any headline attached to the Cromwell name. Responses began arriving from archivists, provenance specialists, and institutional custodians who had worked with her for years. None of them cared about Alastair's engagement announcement. They cared about evidence. Facts survive. By the end of the week, Quinn had assembled a 7-generation lineage reconstruction map across donor branches, estate transfers, private baptism records, inheritance ledgers, adoption notations, and unsigned family correspondence. She marked each branch by source reliability, not social convenience. A true genealogist did not chase rumors. She rebuilt bloodlines one verified record at a time. It stretched across generations of family histories and connected branches long forgotten by public narratives. As she reviewed the chart, a hidden relationship emerged again and again through independent sources. The connection was still incomplete, but every new document pointed in the same direction. Quinn marked the intersection with a red notation tab and continued working. Meanwhile, Alastair was doing the opposite. Public interviews promoting the future of the Cromwell auction empire began appearing in industry publications. Quinn watched one recording while reviewing records. A journalist asked about the values that would guide the next generation of the family. Alastair answered without hesitation. He spoke about lineage, heritage, blood, tradition. He described noble ancestry as the foundation of lasting influence. The language caught Quinn's attention immediately, not because it sounded impressive, because it sounded desperate. He needed that. The more she listened, the clearer his weakness became. Alastair was not obsessed with wealth. He already had wealth. He was obsessed with legitimacy. He had spent years trying to gain acceptance from circles that viewed him as successful but not truly established. Old collections, old names, old families. Every acquisition, every donation, and every public relationship seemed designed to purchase belonging. Quinn understood the psychology because she had helped build the image. Now she could finally see the fear underneath it. He feared being ordinary. He feared being dismissed as temporary. Most of all, he feared discovering that the story he told himself about bloodline superiority might not survive examination. Records remember. Quinn returned to the lineage chart and opened a newly arrived estate file. One verified signature connected a donor registry from decades earlier to a family branch that should have remained separate from the Cromwell narrative. Another document reinforced it. Then another. The evidence chain was strengthening. Keep digging. Hours later, she completed a preliminary authentication report and secured it inside the red wax provenance file. The conclusion was still unfinished. The implications were not. For the first time, Quinn could see the outline of a truth powerful enough to collapse an entire social mythology. She closed the file carefully and placed her hand on the cover. The records were beginning to speak. Soon everyone else would hear them too. In elite circles, people spend fortunes protecting their family names. Very few spend the same effort protecting whether those names are true. The strange thing about history is that it rarely disappears. Most of the time, it simply waits. Documents wait. Records wait. Forgotten signatures wait. People often assume power belongs to the person holding the microphone, standing beneath the spotlight, or sitting at the head of the table. Yet power built on appearance is fragile. Real power belongs to whatever survives verification. Quinn Rothschild understood that now. Alastair had removed her name from walls, invitations, and public narratives. He believed visibility created truth. Quinn had spent her career learning the opposite lesson. Truth creates visibility eventually. The timing is simply different. Records remember. By the following month, Quinn had established a new working routine inside a private heritage archive trusted by museums, collectors, family foundations, and international appraisal organizations. The building stood several miles from the Cromwell auction headquarters, hidden behind an understated limestone facade that revealed nothing about the value stored inside. Quinn preferred it that way. The archive contained authenticated family records, acquisition histories, donor registries, estate documents, and provenance materials spanning generations. Unlike social circles, records had no favorites. They either matched or they did not. Facts survive. Each morning, Quinn reviewed newly acquired documentation connected to the lineage map she had been constructing. Additional estate files arrived from heritage institutions. Historical trust records appeared from private collections. A preservation office released documentation connected to an inheritance dispute settled decades earlier. Every source strengthened the same conclusion. The evidence chain was becoming remarkably difficult to challenge. Yet Quinn remained disciplined. She verified every signature, confirmed every date, examined every transfer notation. No assumptions. The professionals around her respected that discipline. A senior appraiser requested her review of a disputed collection. A foundation chair invited her to advise on a heritage authentication matter. A gallery owner sought her opinion regarding provenance inconsistencies affecting a multi-million-dollar acquisition. Quinn accepted only the assignments aligned with her investigation. She was rebuilding something larger than influence. She was rebuilding credibility in her own name. Meanwhile, reports from elite social circles continued reaching her through industry conversations. Alastair's engagement campaign had expanded. Fiona now appeared regularly at collector receptions, donor dinners, and cultural events. She presented herself as the refined future of the Cromwell dynasty. The image worked on people who valued appearances. It worked less effectively on people who valued records. Questions had already started emerging behind closed doors. Small questions. Careful questions. The kind professionals ask when they suspect a story contains missing pages. Quinn never initiated those conversations. She did not need to. The documents were beginning to create their own gravity. Truth leaves traces. Late one evening, Quinn received another authenticated file connected to a branch of family history previously hidden behind sealed estate records. She reviewed the contents slowly. One notation confirmed a relationship she had suspected for weeks. Another corroborated it independently. The chain was nearly complete. For the first time, Quinn allowed herself a brief moment of certainty. Not satisfaction. Certainty. She placed the newest records inside the red wax provenance file and secured the seal. The truth was no longer a possibility. It was becoming a structure. And structures, once completed, are difficult to ignore. 6 weeks after the auction reception, Alastair Cromwell stood beneath crystal chandeliers inside an invitation-only engagement preview hosted in one of the most prestigious cultural venues in the city. The evening had been designed as a statement rather than a celebration. Collectors, patrons, museum trustees, and influential donors moved between private exhibition rooms displaying pieces scheduled to become part of the future Cromwell family collection. Everything communicated permanence. Everything communicated status. Fiona did not simply stand there as decoration. She stepped forward before the auction director introduced her and spoke about becoming the guardian of Cromwell taste, Cromwell refinement, and Cromwell continuity. She described Quinn's old preservation projects as unfinished work that needed a softer, more musical future. The room received it as elegance. Quinn would have recognized it as theft. Guests admired the instrument. They admired the story attached to it even more. Alastair had spent months constructing that story. According to the narrative presented that evening, Fiona represented refinement, artistic heritage, and the next chapter of a family destined for cultural significance. Many guests accepted the performance. Some even applauded it. From a distance, victory appeared complete. Appearances matter. Yet beneath the surface, small fractures had already begun to spread. Throughout the evening, Alastair moved from conversation to conversation, seeking confirmation he rarely admitted needing. He asked donors whether they approved of the direction he was taking the family legacy. He emphasized lineage whenever collectors discussed institutional influence. He repeatedly referenced tradition, heritage, and bloodline as if repeating the words could make them more secure. The pattern was subtle. To most people, it sounded like confidence. To anyone paying close attention, it sounded like reassurance. He needed that. Fiona performed her role flawlessly. She spoke about culture, philanthropy, and the future of the auction house. She smiled for photographs. She greeted influential guests with practiced elegance. Yet even she occasionally encountered questions she could not answer comfortably. A museum patron asked about a historical collection connected to an old family trust. Another guest mentioned provenance concerns recently circulating among preservation professionals. Fiona redirected the conversations politely. The questions remained. Questions spread. Meanwhile, Quinn Rothschild never attended the event. She did not need to. Her absence had become more powerful than her presence. Several attendees noticed it immediately. Others mentioned her name in passing conversations. Each time it happened, Alastair reacted almost imperceptibly. His posture tightened. His responses shortened. Once, when a collector praised Quinn's expertise in heritage authentication, Alastair changed the subject before the discussion could continue. Another guest referenced a preservation project Quinn had helped establish years earlier. Alastair immediately redirected attention toward Fiona's accomplishments. The room noticed. Not everyone. Enough people. The reaction revealed more than any speech could have. Alastair was not competing with Quinn's influence. He was competing with her credibility. That distinction mattered. Across elite circles, reputation could be purchased. Credibility had to be earned. As the evening progressed, the imbalance became increasingly visible. Guests admired Fiona's image. They trusted Quinn's judgment. Those were not the same thing. Records remember. Near the end of the reception, a respected collector quietly asked Alastair whether recent genealogy reviews connected to certain donor estates would affect future family exhibitions. The question was simple. The effect was not. For the first time that evening, Alastair hesitated before answering. Only briefly. Yet the hesitation existed. The collector noticed it. Others did too. A small silence followed before the conversation moved elsewhere. The moment lasted only seconds. Its significance lingered much longer. Later that night, after the final guests departed, Alastair stood alone among displays designed to celebrate certainty. Yet certainty was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The story still belonged to him. For now, the evidence was beginning to belong to someone else. The shift did not begin with a scandal. It began with requests. One collector requested additional provenance verification for a collection scheduled to appear under the Cromwell name. A museum foundation requested clarification regarding family lineage disclosures attached to a future endowment. An estate preservation committee reopened documentation reviews connected to several historical donor records. None of these actions attracted headlines. Yet inside the heritage world, they mattered. Verification was never dramatic. It was relentless. Questions spread. Alastair Cromwell initially dismissed the concerns. His advisors assured him that minor reviews occurred regularly. Donors asked questions. Institutions requested documentation. Collections changed hands. Nothing unusual. Yet the requests continued arriving. Then more arrived. Soon multiple organizations were examining records connected to the same branches of family history Quinn Rothschild had been studying for weeks. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Across private archives and preservation institutions, professionals were independently reaching similar conclusions. They were not investigating Alastair personally. They were investigating the truth. Facts survive. Quinn continued working from the Heritage Archive without seeking publicity or recognition. She expanded the evidence chain inside the Redwax provenance file and submitted authenticated documentation through appropriate professional channels whenever institutions requested it. Every submission contained source verification, chain of custody confirmation, and supporting historical records. Nothing relied on accusation. Everything relied on evidence. That distinction protected the integrity of the process. No assumptions. Meanwhile, subtle changes began appearing throughout the social ecosystem that had once elevated Alastair without hesitation. Invitations still arrived, but they arrived later. Conversations remained polite, yet increasingly cautious. Donors who once accepted family narratives without question now requested supporting documentation. Collectors who previously admired Cromwell branding began consulting independent authentication specialists before making commitments. Then the consequences became structural. A museum partnership was postponed pending genealogical clarification. A collector consortium delayed a private exhibition attached to the Cromwell name. A heritage foundation paused approval on a donor campaign Fiona had expected to headline. None of them accused Alastair. They simply stopped lending him institutional certainty. One afternoon, Alastair attended a private planning session regarding future museum partnerships. Normally, these meetings moved smoothly. This one did not. A foundation chair requested additional genealogy disclosures before approving a proposed cultural initiative. Another representative asked whether recent archival reviews would affect public perception of associated collections. The questions were reasonable. Their timing was not. For the first time, Alastair found himself defending assumptions he had always expected others to accept automatically. He answered carefully. The uncertainty remained. He felt it. Weeks earlier, people sought his approval. Now they sought documentation. Records remember. Fiona noticed the change as well. During a donor dinner, a guest politely asked whether the family intended to release updated heritage records connected to ongoing archival reviews. Fiona attempted to redirect the conversation toward philanthropy and the arts. The guest returned to the same subject. Another guest joined the discussion. Then another. The atmosphere remained courteous. Yet the room no longer revolved around admiration. It revolved around verification. Fiona left the evening unsettled. Alastair left angry. The difference mattered. By early autumn, several institutions had quietly delayed collaborations involving the Cromwell name until outstanding record reviews concluded. No one accused Alastair of wrongdoing. No one needed to. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was asking for proof. Every delay weakened certainty. Every review strengthened scrutiny. Every verified document moved the truth closer to daylight. Late one evening, Quinn received final confirmation from an independent source she trusted completely. The evidence chain was now complete. Multiple authenticated records. Multiple institutional confirmations. Multiple generations connected through the same hidden lineage. She reviewed the documents carefully and placed them inside the red wax provenance file. Then she secured the seal. The investigation was finished. The consequences were only beginning. The collapse began quietly. No public announcement had been made. No official statement had been released. Yet within the heritage world, the conclusion was already moving through private conversations, institutional reviews, and professional networks. The verified records all pointed to the same reality. Fiona Langley was connected by blood to the Cromwell family through Alastair's father. The documentation had survived independent examination. The genealogy chain matched. The supporting records aligned. The truth no longer depended on interpretation. It depended on acceptance. And acceptance was becoming unavoidable. Records remember. Alastair first noticed the change during a private reception attended by collectors, donors, and institutional partners. For years, entering a room had been enough. Conversations paused. Attention shifted. People approached him. This time felt different. A collector who normally greeted him immediately chose to continue speaking with someone else. An investor acknowledged him with a brief nod and returned to another discussion. A museum representative offered polite conversation but avoided committing to future collaborations. Nothing dramatic occurred. That was the problem. The room changed. The certainty that once surrounded him had begun to disappear. Over the following weeks, the pattern intensified. Invitations continued arriving, yet their tone became formal rather than enthusiastic. Donors requested additional reviews before approving partnerships. Preservation boards postponed decisions. Cultural institutions delayed announcements involving the Cromwell name. Every response remained professional. Every delay carried meaning. Questions spread. Alastair responded the only way he knew how. He worked harder to control the narrative. He scheduled interviews, expanded public appearances, increased philanthropic commitments. He spoke about heritage, legacy, and family tradition whenever possible. Yet every attempt produced diminishing returns. The more aggressively he promoted legitimacy, the more people wondered why legitimacy required promotion in the first place. He felt it. One afternoon, he entered his headquarters expecting to finalize a major exhibition partnership. The executive assistant who usually stood immediately upon his arrival remained seated while finishing a conversation. The delay lasted only seconds. It felt much longer. Later that day, a private banker who had spent years treating him with eager attentiveness responded to a request in a measured, neutral tone. No hostility, no deference, just professionalism. Alastair noticed the difference immediately. Too late. Meanwhile, Fiona was confronting a different reality. The next reception, Fiona arrived separately and left before Alastair's final conversation ended. She did not accuse him. She did not defend him. She simply moved through the room as if distance itself had become a form of survival. When a guest asked whether she would still appear at the engagement announcement, Fiona adjusted her pearl-white blouse and answered that all future appearances were being reviewed. Alastair heard it from across the room. That was the cut. Questions regarding her family history had become increasingly difficult to avoid. Invitations that once celebrated her future role within the dynasty now arrived less frequently. Conversations ended sooner. Curiosity replaced admiration. She remained publicly composed, but distance had begun appearing in places where loyalty once seemed guaranteed. During a private event, she noticed several guests lowering their voices when she approached. Another conversation ended abruptly upon her arrival. The silence said enough. The story shifted. For Alastair, the deepest fracture came when he finally understood what was happening. His greatest fear had never been losing money. Wealth could be rebuilt. His greatest fear was being exposed as someone whose status depended on a story rather than substance. He had spent years chasing acceptance from old institutions and established families. Now those same circles were withdrawing without confrontation. No accusations. No battles. Simply distance. The illusion was dissolving. One evening, alone inside an office overlooking the auction floor, Alastair reviewed a growing stack of postponed agreements and suspended partnerships. The documents reflected a truth he could no longer deny. People had not believed in him. They had believed in what he represented. Once that representation weakened, loyalty evaporated. Nobody answered. Across the city, Quinn Rothschild secured the completed red wax provenance file inside a protected archive cabinet. The evidence was ready. The system had already begun delivering consequences. The final confrontation was approaching. Alastair Cromwell waited nearly 40 minutes before Quinn Rothschild agreed to see him. The meeting took place inside a private document room attached to the Heritage Archive, where she had spent months assembling the evidence that now threatened everything he had built. The room was quiet. No reporters waited outside. No audience existed to witness the conversation. That was appropriate. The crisis had begun with records. It would end with them as well. Quinn entered carrying the red wax provenance file. She wore a tailored red blazer and placed the file at the center of a long oak table before taking her seat. Across from her, Alastair looked older than he had only weeks earlier. Not broken, not defeated, simply diminished. The certainty that once defined him had become difficult to locate. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Alastair began. He did not apologize. He did not beg. Instead, he attempted negotiation. He explained that institutions, donors, and preservation boards were overreacting. He argued that public disclosure would damage families, collections, and cultural projects unrelated to the underlying issue. He suggested that some truths served no constructive purpose. His language remained measured. His objective did not. He wanted control returned. Quinn listened without interruption. When he finished, she opened the provenance file. Inside rested authenticated genealogy records, inheritance documents, estate registrations, chain of custody certifications, and independently verified DNA results collected from multiple institutions. She removed several key documents and placed them on the table between them. Read the file. Alastair stared at the records without touching them. He already knew what they contained. The evidence had survived every review, every challenge, every verification request. What remained was not uncertainty. What remained was acceptance. Quinn turned one document toward him, then another, then a third. Each record reinforced the same conclusion. Fiona Langley was connected to the Cromwell bloodline through his father. The family narrative he had promoted as proof of legitimacy had collapsed under its own examination. Records remember. Alastair looked away first. The gesture revealed more than any admission could have. For months, he had fought to preserve an image. Now the image was gone, and the truth remained standing exactly where it had always been. Finally, he asked the question he should have asked years earlier. Why are you doing this? Quinn considered the question carefully. Then she answered, I didn't create this truth. I protected it. Silence settled across the room. Alastair's hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table. The movement was small. The meaning was not. His greatest fear was visible now. Not financial loss. Not public embarrassment. Exposure. He had spent years trying to convince elite circles that bloodline determined value. He had spent years chasing acceptance from families whose approval he believed would make him legitimate. In the end, that obsession had trapped him. Quinn saw it clearly. Then she delivered the truth he could no longer avoid. You didn't lose your legacy because of me. You lost it because you loved the story more than the truth. The words landed with quiet precision. No accusation followed. None was necessary. She continued. You believed a prestigious name could replace character. You believed blood could replace substance. You believed history existed to serve your image. Alastair said nothing. There was nothing left to challenge. The records had already answered every argument. Facts survive. Quinn gathered the documents, returned them to the red wax provenance file, and secured the seal. Then she stood. The meeting was over. Alastair remained seated as she walked toward the door. For the first time since she had known him, he possessed no narrative capable of protecting him. Only evidence remained. Quinn left the room without looking back. Alastair stayed where he was, surrounded by documents that proved the one thing he had spent his entire life trying to outrun. Legitimacy built on illusion never survives verification. Some families spend generations collecting priceless objects. Few realize that the most valuable inheritance is a truth that survives examination. People often imagine justice as a dramatic moment, a verdict, a headline, a public downfall. Real life is usually quieter. A false story loses power one verified fact at a time. A carefully protected illusion weakens with every document that refuses to change its contents. By the time the world notices, the outcome has often been decided for months. That was the lesson hidden beneath everything Quinn Rothschild endured. Alistair Cromwell spent years believing legitimacy could be acquired through appearance, status, and association. Quinn spent the same years learning that legitimacy only survives when it can withstand scrutiny. In the end, the difference between them was not intelligence. It was philosophy. One trusted image. The other trusted evidence. Truth remained. Nearly a year after the confrontation, the heritage world looked very different. Institutional reviews had concluded. Genealogy findings had been formally acknowledged. Multiple cultural organizations had restructured relationships connected to the Cromwell legacy. The consequences extended far beyond one engagement announcement or one family scandal. Entire narratives had been reevaluated. Histories had been corrected. Records had been preserved. Most importantly, professionals across the field had been reminded that verification mattered more than reputation. Quinn never treated that outcome as a victory celebration. She treated it as responsibility. That distinction earned respect. Her work expanded rapidly. International preservation councils sought her guidance on complex lineage disputes. Museums requested independent authentication reviews. Heritage foundations invited her to oversee standards governing provenance verification and historical transparency. She accepted each role with the same discipline that had guided her investigation. Verify everything. The title eventually followed. Quinn became chair of the International Heritage Appraisal Council, one of the most respected positions in the field. Yet the achievement that mattered most to her could not be printed on a business card. It was ownership of her own name. No institution could remove it now. No family could erase it. No narrative could replace it. Facts survive. On the evening of the grand opening of Rothschild Auction Hall, collectors, historians, archivists, museum leaders, and preservation specialists filled a luminous auction chamber designed around transparency, authentication, and public trust. There were no giant portraits celebrating a dynasty. No speeches about bloodlines. No claims of inherited superiority. Instead, illuminated displays showcased verified provenance histories and authenticated cultural treasures from around the world. Quinn stood at the center of the auction floor wearing a tailored red suit. Above the stage, her name appeared in understated lettering. Nothing extravagant. Nothing performative. It was enough. Across the city, the Cromwell building remained sealed behind temporary barriers while creditors, investors, and former partners resolved the consequences of years spent protecting image over truth. Few people stopped to look anymore. The story had moved on. So had Quinn. As the first auction of the evening began, she glanced across the room at generations of history preserved through careful stewardship rather than personal ambition. Then she took her seat. No more permission. The future before her required no defense, no explanation, and no borrowed legitimacy. It belonged to her because she had earned it. That was enough. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.